Hello, this is John Quinlan. Welcome to this edition of Forward Forum. We're taping here at the Sun Prairie Media Center on April 24th, 2015. Very special show today. We'll be commemorating the life of former Congressman Bob Kastenmeier, who served the 2nd Congressional District centered on Madison from 1958 to 1990. Bob passed away at the age of 91 back in March. We're very pleased to be joined in studio today with Editor Emeritus of the CapTimes, Dave Zweifel. Dave, hey, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So good to have you here. I wanted to get started, as I said, we're going to be talking about Bob Kastenmeier's life, roughly chronological order. But as we're getting started here, I want to get more of a sense of the man himself, some of the scope of his accomplishments. And I think as we get started, Neil Heinen, the editorial director of WISC, was kind enough to share the editorial he did upon Bob's passing. So Neil Heinen on Bob Kastenmeier.
This is a WISC TV3 editorial with editorial director Neil Heinen.
These days, the death of an old school politician, one who we used to refer to as a statesman, who we respected and trusted, is all the more depressing for its stark contrast to the polar opposite passing for a politician today. So it is with the death last week of former Congressman Bob Kastenmeier. Kastenmeier represented Madison and Dane County in the House of Representatives for 32 years, from 1959 to 1991. His reputation was as a champion of civil liberties and peace, a critic of the Vietnam War, and an early expert on intellectual property. But Kastenmeier distinguished himself as a gentleman and a champion of the people. His colleague, former Congressman David Obey, called Kastenmeier the most honest public official he'd ever dealt with. Indeed, Bob Kastenmeier was a good, decent, fair, and honest man. He represented our community honorably and with pride for more than 3 decades, and he remains a vivid reminder of what is possible when good people have the courage to do good.
Dave Zweifel, just to give our viewers a bit of context, you're a very young-looking guy, so you couldn't possibly have been around in the 1950s and 1960s here.
Yeah, right.
But just to give people sort of a sense, so you first attended the UW. You're from New Glarus. You attended the UW-Madison beginning in 1958.
Right.
Is that right?
That's correct.
And then early in the 60s, became part of the CapTimes newsroom. We talked about events around the Kennedy assassination. There was a time you went away to the Army in Oklahoma and other things. But anyway, you were on the scene during this time, and I think you were also actively involved in the Democratic Party when you were a student. So when's the first time you became aware of Bob Kastenmeier?
Well, I was an avid reader of the CapTimes as a high school kid, and when I went off to college in Madison, it was in 1958, and that was with Bob's first victory. He had run in 56, got beat. And then in 1958, he actually unseated a guy named Don Hughes, I think his name was. And I was a member, while in school, of the Young Dems, the University of Wisconsin Young Democrats, along with Dave Obey and that whole crew of ne'er-do-wells that we all came to be.
6 years later, when I was 4 years old in Wausau in 1964, the Obies were our neighbors across the street.
Oh, really?
So,
yeah. But at any rate, so I became aware of Bob Kastenmeier. In fact, he came to address us a couple times, the Young Democrats on campus in the campaign, especially during that 1958 campaign. So I was right away was impressed with the kind of gentleman that this man was. I mean, he wasn't your typical politician, and in fact, I don't think Bob Kastenmeier was really like being called a politician. He envisioned himself as a legislator who was able to, he had his very strong views and how he felt the government ought to operate, but his main concern was how to get these enacted and to make them work for his constituency and for the country and overall. And so when I started at CapTimes in 1962, Kastenmeier already was running for his 3rd re-election, and we, the CapTimes was a huge supporter of Kastenmeier. Our William T. Evu, who was still the editor and publisher, thought very highly of him, as did Miles McMillan, who was the associate publisher and became the editor and publisher when Mr. Evu died in 1970. So Kastenmeier was always very close to the paper. he believed in many of the same things that we did editorially, and so we always had this very close relationship. But what was always struck me most about Bob Kastenmeier was what a heck of a nice guy he was.
Yeah.
And he was never what today we call a bomb thrower, or to some personal attacks and things like that. He was always fair and a gentleman, and that's what really set him apart from many of the politicians, even back then. Yeah.
A couple of bullet points of his life. He was born in 1924, Beaver Dam,
Right,
where I went to high school.
Oh, really? Okay.
And probably surprises the Fitzgerald brothers that such a progressive icon
Right,
comes
yeah.
out of Beaver Dam. I think married in roughly 1954 to his wife Dorothy. He was 34 in 1958 when he first was elected to Congress. And but just to give folks that maybe don't know this historical perspective, I've had a lot of conversations recently with folks like Mike McCabe and others reflecting on that late 50s, early 60s kind of renaissance in progressive politics. We talk about Gaylord Nelson, Pat Lucey, all the changes that happened in this short span from having Joe McCarthy as our senator,
Right.
suddenly having Prox and Gaylord, in there,
yeah.
and changing hands in the legislature, all that other stuff. Do you think there are lessons from what happened back then for those of us who are kind of discouraged about the right-wing takeover of Wisconsin in recent years?
Oh, yes, I think there are. I think that harkens me back to the column I did about Bob just before he passed away.
Just to establish context, you had the chance to interview him roughly about 10
Right,
years before
I
he
gave him a
passed.
call and sort of a whim, and I just check in and see how he was doing, and we had a really very nice 30-minute conversation. And but his bottom line was, hey, don't give up the ship. Things will get better, but it requires that we continue to work as hard as we possibly can, and the people will eventually, come around to understanding that there's a better way to do things, and that was his message, I think.
You're mentioning somebody who was just a really down-to-earth, very friendly guy. I'm gonna play our clips a little bit out of the order I intended because I want to expand on that theme a little bit. Mara, could you cue up clip 3 if you could, the video clip? But essentially, the point he was making here in an interview he conducted with C-SPAN in December of 1990, just as he was moving out of his congressional offices. I think we haven't established this,
Okay.
but though he was in office from 1958 to 1990, he met a stunning defeat that surprised everyone. In 1990, Scott Klug, a local Channel 27 anchor person, kind of came out of nowhere, it seemed, and because of successful ads and a whole lot of other things, suddenly Bob was out of office. But he was pretty circumspect about it. And but this is kind of more on a humorous note. I think C-SPAN, which of course is kind of very stern and matter of fact anyway in its tone. I was asking him kind of a question about the notion of whether he was in any way flamboyant. So let's play clip 3 if we could, Maura.
In a recent biography written by Congressional Quarterly, they say that, quote, you have a distaste for flamboyance. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I think that's right. Probably more than most members. I would, if it were a question of, in terms of my own style, I just do not have a flamboyant style. I don't try to over-dramatize things particularly. It might be useful to do that occasionally, and I actually admire some of my friends who are able to call upon a degree of flamboyance to make a point. But that's not my style, and never has been, and obviously never will be.
And Mara, just to cue you, we're going to go next to clip 8 in just a second here. But any thoughts on that? Watching the C-SPAN interview, I've got to admit, unlike Russ or Tammy or certainly Mark Pocan, who has this sense of humor he injects into everything. He's a pretty good show person.
Yeah.
I got a sense. I don't think I've only heard Bob speak on a couple of occasions, but that wasn't his style. But on the other hand, he was very accessible. People listened to what he had to say because he was so real.
Yes, and so serious about it. He I think, always came across with the sort of an aura that he had studied really deeply, the topics that he was talking about. and that he was. And when he spoke, it was like maybe perhaps listening to a university professor, give him a lecture that he knew this issue, he knew the pros and cons, and here's the right way that he felt it ought to be done, some issue ought to be handled, and he he didn't joke about it, he didn't rail about it, he just spoke about it, and. I think that's what sort of it was sort of it distinguished him from others at the time, you know, and I think was one of the reasons that the second district really just kept sending him back to Congress, up until 1990.
Which was really something, because the demographics of the district were very different than the district today.
Oh,
which
absolutely,
has been
right, yeah.
Very, very friendly. Like I said, Beaver Dam used to be part of the district, and very
Right,
conservative.
very conservative. And he actually lived in Watertown when he first ran.
Yeah.
And he had moved to Watertown, I think, as I recall, to open a law practice there, and then ran for Congress and maintained his residency in Watertown. It was always sort of an anomaly, Watertown being this very conservative, predominantly German, city.
Right.
And here was this, one of the icons of congressional liberals, hailing from Watertown and being in Congress. It was always sort of you sort of wondered how this worked.
It strikes me there's a lesson there, that's echoed in folks like Russ Feingold and Tammy Baldwin. This notion that a really progressive person who sticks to their ideals and to their issues can't be elected in Wisconsin. Well, he kind of went against that.
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah, and
it seems like again it was his authenticity that he was willing to stand for something.
And one of the things that Bob did when he first got into office, he hired a very strong staff, and he was insistent that his staff serve the people in his constituency, in his district, and whether they were conservatives or liberals, and he wanted them all treated alike, and he had a staff that I guess maybe this. He would never get into a problem like Tammy has over this VA hospital thing.
Okay.
He had staff people who followed through, who dotted the T's and crossed the T's and dotted the I's, and made people feel good about contacting their representative.
There are a variety of folks who come to mind. I got to know his staff primarily in the 1980s. So this is the realm of Helen Bukelek, Paul Rusk, who's now on the county board. But I think what impressed me, it was the first time I'd really worked with the congressional office. Mara, I hate to do this, but those two pictures that are later in the lineup of Janek, Janak, if you could bring those up just a second. There was a case in 1984. My best friend from Beaver Dam had brought his young cousin, who was 12 years old, over from Poland. He had leukemia, and he was being treated at EW Hospital. Turned out, unfortunately, we couldn't treat him, but we just had an amazing summer. Took him to the 4th of July parade in Columbus and all around, and got flown down to Disney World by another relative. But because in October of 1984, young Janek was dying at his bedside. He had come from Poland. We wanted to bring his mother back in the era of the Iron Curtain. It was Bob Kastenmeier and his staff that made that possible, that connected all the dots at the State Department and everything else. He came and visited Janek, and then I think it was maybe 12 hours before Janek passed, his mother arrived. So for me, that just brings home, how important, the role of a congressional office can be in facilitating positive connection with your government.
Yeah, and he did. And he had a staff that underscored that. Kaz Oshiki as chief of staff, a young guy named Stu Applebaum, who was a real activist on campus back during the early 60s, was one of his researchers in his office. It really was a very can-do kind of a staff. And I remember as a young editor talking to people in Madison, Chamber of Commerce types and business leaders who were far from being liberal, and probably opposed him at election time. But they had nothing but great things to say about if they had a problem, that needed help from their congressman, they felt very at ease contacting Bob Kastenmeier's staff and were treated as if they were political allies.
Apologize for the stream of thought here, but I mean, the other general point is, again, he was well respected across all political lines. So because of his involvement with the judiciary,
Right.
conservative justices, noted
Right.
his passing and spoke with great affection of him.
Yes, they did, yeah. From Chief Justice Rehnquist
Yep.
to Berger, to Warren Berger even, had great things to say about him when he was defeated back in 1990. They'd lost this real friend of the courts, and that was very telling.
As the obituaries came rolling in from the Washington Post and the New York Times and the other national media, these issues of intellectual property, he championed massive reforms that had international implications in terms of copyright reform, and essentially, guarding the right of people to be able to publish something you, I'm sure, appreciate as a journalist that for example, extended the period of time well beyond death that someone has rights to their works.
Yeah, in the family, right, exactly.
But it was interesting because Mario, we're about to play clip 8 if we could. In the context of the C-SPAN interview, as the interviewer was asking him to talk about the scope of his accomplishments, he mentioned that, but he mentioned it at the end, and there were several other things he mentioned first. Be curious to hear what you think of the things that he considered were some of his greatest accomplishments. Clip 8, if you could, Maura.
What legislative trademark will you leave on the House? What issues do you feel you've had the biggest impact with in your 32 years here?
I think the important issues to which I made some form of contribution probably were civil rights. In the early years, I worked very hard when we had the formative civil rights bills. Civil liberties was very important for me. I served in a wiretapping commission. My own subcommittee, for example, repealed Title II of the Internal Security Bill, which provided for detention camps in America, specifically nominating where these camps are to be. I thought that was important and typical of the sort of civil liberties issues through the period in which even today still exist. I was also interested in prisons, and civil rights for institutionalized persons in any setting was a bill that came out of my committee. I've always had a primary concern about war-peace questions and arms control, because I've always felt that even civil liberties and civil rights become secondary to war. If you have war, you will not have much in the way of civil rights or civil liberties, potentially, certainly thermonuclear war. In later years, I devoted a great deal of time also to, as I say, prisons, courts, intellectual property. I wrote the new Copyright Act of 1976, I should say. I alone, but obviously it was a product of my subcommittee. I worked with the Senate over many years, probably 15 years on that. And it is today extremely important in terms of international trade, the United States' position in the world. Copyright is pervasive, it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. It's proprietary rights in all forms of communication: cable, television, movies, computers, all publications, books, records, about everything you can think of. Led to a major bill just several years ago on which sort of set the ground rules for protecting communications, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act.
So certainly intellectual property, as was reported,
Right.
was one of those important things. But let's start with some of the other things that he mentioned. Again, for folks who maybe aren't, don't have a grasp of that particularly historic time, the early 60s, of course, were a time of amazing landmark developments in terms of civil rights legislation. It sounds like he was there from the very beginning.
He was, and as a matter of fact, his reputation back then in the early '60s, when I first joined the paper, you viewed Bob Kastenmeier as being this real champion of civil liberties and civil rights, and he was well ahead of even LBJ, back in those days, and in the importance of passing legislation that guaranteed equal rights and did away with the Jim Crow, problems in the South, and so he was a real champion of that, and I think made his reputation. Really, his early reputation was actually in that area. I have to say that when he started talking about the intellectual property rights, which was sort of at the end of what turned out to be the end of his career in Congress. It wasn't
a significant commitment over almost a couple of decades.
Right,
So,
and it was it was not a sexy issue, and obviously it wasn't one that you can make 30-second sound bites out of for your TV ads and stuff like that. But if you notice, he says, "Well, I did this, not just me."
Right.
And it said so much to me. That says so much about the guy. He was never one to blow his horn, and I think that was one of the reasons he may have lost in 1990. His staff would try to build him up, and he would chastise them for making him look too good.
It was either Paul Rusk or Helen V. Kellogg who conveyed that to me. There were times when he read them out. He said, "What are you doing getting that release out there? I'm not, don't. It's not all about me." It's,
And that's really the contrast to today, because if you're in politics today, you take credit for whatever you can take credit for.
You spin everything, you use every opportunity you can. He didn't do that.
If it wasn't for me, nothing would happen, kind of a thing. But he was exactly the opposite. I think that's what endeared him to so many people, back in those days.
So the issues he talks about. They speak to a life experience that is kind of surprising. Again, you and I grew up in rural Wisconsin, so I don't mean to demean any of us, but it's pretty remarkable, especially that commitment on a really deep level to civil rights. He also in the C-SPAN interview in talking about this bill that essentially removed the authority of a president to establish internment camps again. I mean, he worked in coalition with Asian Americans and African Americans and the Jewish community and other folks, who of course understood why that was so wrongheaded that we could do that. So how did this guy from Beaver Dam get those deeper insights? The other thing elsewhere in the C-SPAN interview, when he first went with I think about 70 of his liberal colleagues to propose civil rights legislation and met with John Kennedy. As we've learned in history, JFK was a bit ambivalent about this because of the political battles that lay ahead for civil rights. Of course, later echoed with what LBJ faced and kind of push-pull that was going on there. But what he talks about is that he wanted voting rights legislation that wouldn't just affect people in terms of voting for federal office, but he wanted it to be able to reach that person who was voting for sheriff in Alabama too. But again, that implies a worldview, a sense of the totality, the picture, an understanding of diverse peoples. It's pretty rare. Where did that come from?
That's an extremely good question, John. I think it's because of his just interest in the common guy and his growing up perhaps in Beaver Dam and practicing law in Watertown, but he was a real student. Like I mentioned before, he sort of was like a university professor giving a lecture. And he was he went deeply into the issues and balanced the pros and cons of people's rights and how they were being denigrated by certain laws or certain actions, and I think he just in his belly he came up with his philosophy that everybody deserves to be treated equally, and it's time that this country do that. And
It seems like this is a quality that's maybe lacking, in these polarized times.
Yeah.
This ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, even though that
Right.
experience may be very different than your own.
Yeah, it's might be a subject to really take a good look at. I don't know of any particular experiences he had before he first ran in '56 that would have caused this in him, but it probably just being a student of government in this country was probably what made him do what he did.
He did this, I think, from the perspective of Wisconsin. I don't know if we'll have a chance to play this later, but they were talking about when he first came to Washington. I don't think he'd been to Washington before he was elected.
I think that's right.
And he had this childlike sense of awe about the beauty of the city and its monuments and other things. So it's not that he was a man who had lived all over the world or even lived in particularly diverse places, but you're right. It's just something in his gut.
Yeah, I think it was.
Well, I want to go through a little bit of a chronology. Some of the folks who had different reactions to Bob's passing and respect and comments on his legacy, and borrow generously from some of what you wrote back in March, if we could. But I want to start with the personal. And actually, it was in June 1952, I guess, he married Dorothy Chambers. And Mara, if you could bring up the word slide that talks about his wife, Dorothy. And so she said she had no idea that this somewhat introverted lawyer with a strong commitment to the Democratic Party would become a congressman. I was totally unprepared for that, she said. I was flabbergasted. This is an interview with the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. With the caveat that she would not be required to give speeches, Dorothy supported her husband's career. It was, she said, an exciting time to be in Washington, one that reached its stride when JFK was sworn in as president in '61. We were young, she said. Everything was new. I think it's interesting. I've done recent shows on George McGovern, and finding pictures of Eleanor is not hard. Same thing with Gaylord Nelson, and I'm sorry, I not remember his wife's first name. We're both there. That's all right.
Senior moments here.
I met her at George McGovern's funeral, ironically. I had a wonderful conversation with her. But anyway, just all of these folks, had spouses who were also visible, parts of their lives. I couldn't, in searching around the internet, find a picture of Dorothy and Bob. And perhaps it's because, choices were made in terms of privacy and other things. But do you have a sense of who she was?
No, I don't. I've talked to her on occasion, and I do know that she's a very outgoing person who
doesn't like to make speeches, but
doesn't like
she's
to make
not
speeches,
outgoing.
but she's very friendly and and accessible. And but I think one who was happy just to stay in the background as Bob continued his political career.
Well, there's a parallel there, because it strikes me in doing shows on someone like Midge Miller or Mancini, I get a sense that their spouses were there and supported a lot of their work. Everything they did was integrated in.
Right.
Or Ed Garvey and his wife, or Joe and Joanne Elder, or other things. They were a team in some ways.
Right.
But sometimes one member of the team is more visible than the other.
Dorothy was really not very visible in the campaigns and things like that. But she was. I know she was a huge support to him, and of course she raised a family, the three sons, and was always there for him. But she was not. She was one not to really get out there in front.
Another voice we want to bring is Dave Obey, and if we could go to that slide, Mara. As Dave said, he was the most honest public official I ever dealt with. I never saw Bob cast a vote in his life that he cast for political reasons. I don't think I can say that about anybody else. In my view, he was one of the greatest legislators of his era. He was very progressive. He was extremely bound by conscience. He was one of the first to stand up to LBJ on the Vietnam War. He was probably one of the most outspoken people in the House on that issue. And he thought it was a futile war. And we should note that Dave Obey is among those folks who will be paying tribute to him. Actually, I don't think we've mentioned this, but on Sunday, May 3rd, 1:30 p.m. at Monona Terrace, and you'll also be speaking on that issue. It's right. Dave Obey, I think more roughly your age. As you said, you went to college with him, or university with him. But they were cut from the same cloth in some ways. So people of integrity, progressive people from districts that weren't necessarily in keeping with their ideology, but nonetheless they persevered and and the people paid them by reelecting them.
Right.
Again, two of the longest-serving members of Congress.
Right. And two distinct personalities.
That's true too. Yeah, Dave was not the lack of flamboyance
No,
or
right.
getting himself out there was definitely not there.
Dave, of course, had this short temper, and
Yep.
and still does. But and Bob, on the other hand, had this. I'd never seen him exhibit any kind of anger. You
Right.
know, it was just he's very calm and collected, and like everybody says, a gentleman. You know, that doesn't mean Obie's not a gentleman, but he
has his moments.
But he has his moments. That's
Right.
right. He prides himself in raising hell, and I think Bob is sort of the opposite.
Well, I think I've heard Dave remark in conversation too that I mean I think more than Bob, he considered the 1990 election a betrayal. He said,
Yeah.
what are you people in Madison doing?
Right,
Do you
yeah.
not realize the treasure that you have in this
Yeah,
man?
Dave was really taken aback. Just on a personal note, I was a longtime member of the American Society of Newspaper Editors, and I'd go to Washington every spring for our convention. And the attorney for the ASNE, Society of Newspaper Editors, became a very close personal friend of Bob Kastenmeier's. And whenever we needed help for open government issues and things like that, Bob was a go-to guy. He was extremely forceful in believing that government needed to be open, meetings needed to be open, and he was active in the creation of the Freedom of Information Act. I mean, he was a complete openness kind of a guy. So obviously the lawyer for the newspaper editors gravitated towards him.
I was going to say, you guys probably had a natural
An
affinity
natural
there.
affinity, yeah.
Yeah.
And then when I remember the morning after the election, the guy's name was Dick Schmitz. He calls. He said, "Zweifel, what in the hell is going on up there? How could this happen?"
Right.
And it was to those kind of causes, it was a real blow. I mean,
Yeah.
viewed as a real blow to whether it was civil liberties or whether it was press issues or things like that. It was those advocates for those causes were incredibly taken aback by it all.
We'll come back to that question of what happened in 1990 in just a minute, but I do want to get some other statements out here from other public officials. Let's go to the slide for Tammy Baldwin, if we could. You probably know this, but Tammy's been one of my best friends since the mid-1980s. We met on Rainbow Coalition stuff, and I saw her through the county board, the state legislature, and both houses of Congress now.
Yeah.
But I remember from earliest times her having this enormous affection and respect for Bob. And what she remarked on his passing is he was a dedicated public servant who was a strong voice for Wisconsin's proud progressive values and traditions. His optimistic spirit will live on in me and other elected officials who were touched by his life's work. And more, if we could also go to the slide that has Bob and Tammy campaigning together. We'll get this resonance with Mark Pocan as well, but there are a lot of young, up-and-coming politicians that cut their teeth, essentially, in working on Bob's campaigns.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and it's, that's one of the problems I think today with the...
Very young Tammy there.
Yeah, right.
And this is the problem today? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
Well,
interrupt
I
you.
think one of the problems today is we don't seem to be able to build those young, the Pocans and the Tammy Baldwins and some of those other future candidates like we were, I think, during the Kastenmeier years. And that's also an interesting topic that might be a good column maybe.
Absolutely, a good future show. We'll have you back.
Trying to figure out why it was what caused these young people to be influenced by Kastenmeier to themselves eventually follow in his footsteps.
I would argue journalists need to do that too sometimes. We need to
Absolutely.
bring other folks along.
No kidding.
It's so important.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to do this a little out of sequence. We will come back to actually Mark Pocan in a moment, but I wanted to intersperse something you had in your column. These are comments on Scott Walker. Again, we bring that slide up. What you said at the time was he's not a big fan of Scott Walker, to put it mildly, and he's particularly concerned about the governor's budgetary attack on the University of Wisconsin. Yes, Walker is doing well as a possible contender for the GOP's presidential nomination, but according to Bob, I tell my friends it's not a good sign when 47 to 48% of the people in your home state not only don't agree with you, they hate you bitterly. This is a big negative that people out of the state don't realize. Still, the former congressman added, Walker is likely to be one of the 2 or 3 who will be up there when it comes down to the final selection. He still gives the edge, though, to Jeb Bush. So have you talked to him over the years since Walker ascended to the governorship? How did he feel about what happened? You get a sense of how he felt about the protests at the Capitol?
Well, you know, I have to confess I have not, and
Yep.
as a matter of fact, it was a stroke of luck for me, I guess, that I called him when I did, and because I hadn't talked to him for 4 or 5 years, and it was during all this Scott Walker and Act 10 and the recalls and everything else. So I don't know how he did feel about that. Obviously, I could certainly guess how he felt about it, but he certainly was no fan of Scott Walker, but he also gave the guy credit for being a good politician, to being able to win elections, and like he said, will be among the top 2 or 3 for the nomination.
It's a hard one to parse out. I was talking about that with Mike McCabe, who also said he was a very, Walker's a very, we shouldn't underestimate him. Everybody who wants to say he's going to blow up someday, he's very good. But of course, distinction being he's working a very broken system. So
yes, well, that's very true. That's very true.
Yeah, but I would imagine you did admire him for that. But I mean, again, it strikes me this historic resonance that Bob Kastenmeier is somebody who saw the rise and the fall of Joe McCarthy. Mm-hmm. I don't know if Walker's quite in that category. I do think there are demagogic tendencies there, but perhaps something similar might happen there too.
That's true. Yeah, and also, there's if you take a look at Scott Walker's staff and so on, it's amazing to me how he's been able to surround himself with people who always get into trouble.
Yeah.
And it's to me that says something about how carefully you really care about what your staff is doing. But that was a real difference between Walker and Bob Kastenmeier, for example. That Kastenmeier made sure that he had staff people who not only believed the way he did, but also would have the gumption to carry it through.
Yeah. Well, one of the other subjects that came up in conversation is a possible run by Russ Feingold to try to reclaim a Senate seat.
Yeah.
And if we go to that slide, Maura, as Russ said upon Bob's passing, Bob's commitment to civil liberties and civility in politics was one of my earliest inspirations. He will be deeply missed as a model of public service and as a friend. And what you wrote in your column said, meanwhile, Bob is ecstatic over the possibility that former Senator Russ Feingold is planning a comeback, taking on the man who beat him in 2010, Ron Johnson. Russ will have a wonderful chance to win, Kastenmeier protected. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, he was sincerely happy about that. I think he was a real fan of Russ Feingold's, and I think he was almost as devastated by Feingold's loss as he was by his own loss in 1990. And I don't know this for a fact, but I've got a hunch that Bob Kastenmeier, if he had the opportunity, was pushing Feingold to come back. And so it's interesting how that might work out. Obviously, Kastenmeier would not have been a good friend of Ron Johnson's, but he certainly was of Feingold.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. Again, I'm sorry to ask a distinguished journalist to do a lot of guessing here, but you have any sense of how he reacted to the 1980 Republican landslide that swept Ronald Reagan into office and swept out so many progressive politicians?
Like Gaylord and
George McGovern. I guess where we can reflect is maybe from 1980 to 1990. In some ways, he was a voice in the minority.
He was, yeah. I think he probably. I certainly could go back and look at the clips and see, because I'm sure we had a lot of stories about Kastenmeier's reaction back then. But he probably, bottom line, said, "Hey guys, don't give up the ship."
Right.
I think that's what he said. His indication to me about not giving up the ship now, that hey, you go through periods of when people don't agree with you, when you're on the outs, but eventually, if you work hard and get your message out, they will return. So.
And I think it was this dual message he was probably expressing in 1980. Again, this is a guess, but similar to other times, he took this personally on some level. He probably really felt for these guys in ways that it probably didn't translate in 1990 for himself, because he was circumspect again.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, Mark Pocan also, if we go to that slide, it was somebody who believed that Bob was very important in terms of his aspirations and his getting involved in politics. Mark said, "I got my start in national politics knocking on doors for Bob's campaigns while in college. He was a leading voice for civil rights and civil liberties and an advocate for peace." Of course, since 1990, we had Scott Klug in there for about 8 years, Tammy, and then Mark. Any reflections on resonances in terms of the style of those three folks?
Well, obviously, Tammy and Mark are the two different personalities than Bob Kastenmeier was. I think their principles, what they stand for, and their views on how to get things done are pretty similar. Mark Pocan has been an example of one of the few politicians willing to reach across the aisle, which I think was very much what Bob Kastenmeier often did.
Both really progressive guys that weren't afraid to talk with the Republicans.
Talk to the other guys, And Tammy has been, she's been a calm and collected representative and senator, and one not prone to, jump at conclusions, and is willing to listen to other viewpoints. And so I think that some of that Kastenmeier influence has rubbed off on those two politicians.
Yeah, I would say very specifically with Tammy, remembering some of the early legislative, efforts that she made.
Right.
Thinking about especially reaching out to folks knowing she was probably going to run for Congress eventually in the counties that surrounded Madison that were very conservative, and some other politicians. She wasn't afraid to do that, and I think she saw what Bob Kastenmeier did.
Right, and just her campaign for the Senate, against Tommy. I mean, she had to go out there and in some of the states, most conservative areas, and who, as a woman and as a lesbian and one who was considered to be a Dane County liberal, for gosh sakes, she walked into the enemy's camp and won him over, and I think that says volumes about the kind of politician that she is, and I am sure that that Bob Kastenmeier was I shouldn't say sure, he was one of her mentors, of course, and I think a lot of that rubbed off.
Well, again, just to punctuate that intergenerational tie, I remember I had the honor of introducing Tammy to Dave Obey, and again, I know in the pep talks that he gave her, be true to yourself. Don't try to water down your message. Right. Get yourself out there. And in the 7th Congressional District, which is a very conservative, purple, almost pink or red district, Dave Obey was able to succeed, and he was telling Tammy, you can do the same thing too.
Right. Well, as you noticed, what will be said about Kastenmeier, that Kastenmeier was one that never made a vote based on politics,
right,
but based on what he felt was right, his principles, and I think that's huge.
Well, it's a reminder too that progressive politics, the progressive movement in Wisconsin, is not something pie in the sky or out there or on the fringes. No. It's pretty fundamental to the beliefs of the people of the state.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to bring another staff perspective in. The next slide, Mike Remington, who is a staffer, the picture that we'll see, this is part of this slide, is that Bob was representing the U.S. negotiating a treaty on intellectual property in respect to integrated circuits. Pretty geeky stuff here, but he was at the World Intellectual Property Organization up in Washington. Had the headset because this was an international related issue where the translation in the UN style was there. But what Mike Remington had to say, who was in several different roles, staffing committees, later an organization that Bob headed up, said that Bob was an uncommon politician, humble, shy, with a brilliant legal mind, totally committed to the rule of law. He was a listener, not a talker, and I want to come back to that in a second. When he talked, though, people listened. Throughout life, he was a loyal Wisconsinite, serious Badger and Packers fan, rooter for all Wisconsin sports. He was politically liberal, but an individual fiscal conservative, imbued with Wisconsin idea and progressive thinking, committed to sifting and winnowing the facts underlying societal problems before pursuing legislative reforms and ethical without reproach. Above all, he was modest. He instructed staff not to brag about his accomplishments, as we remarked on earlier, and he routinely avoided presidential signing ceremonies for bills that he authored. So a lot is crammed into that wonderful testimonial. But again, this notion of him being a listener, that's pretty rare in a politician.
Yes, yes. And of course, the modesty is quite rare as well, as we've discussed before. But Mike was, of course, one of Bob's treasured staff people, and he did an enormous amount of work for Kastenmeier.
So I wanted to put some excerpts up from a piece by do I have the initials right? FW Apple? It was RW Apple. RW Apple, yeah, from the New York Times, who had written an analysis a few days after the election, trying to figure out what had happened. And Mara, if we could put that slide up. And unfortunately, I don't have that in front of me, but essentially, I think the gist of what he was trying to feel out about all of this. He mentions just last Tuesday that an incumbent of Congress from a very liberal district lost, something that was really an anomaly in that particular election. And so some of the speculation was, of course, that this was a district that was mixed and that there were conservative folks, out there. He mentioned that the voting totals on the east side around the Oscar Mayer plant were down, so perhaps some disconnection with working class people, which is, of course, a standard conundrum in progressive politics now. The what's the matter with Kansas syndrome, that people vote against their best interest, essentially. And just maybe, just also some notion, again, of who the guy was who was opposing him, who was a very adept communicator. And I think the polls had Bob, far ahead, but in the last minute, some campaign ads by Klug came on. That was just essentially talking about what maybe was, something symptomatic of that time. That, business as usual wasn't something people wanted. They wanted new voices and other things, and somehow Klug appealed to that.
Right, and there was a real, anti-Congress, attitude among a lot of the voters as well. That we need. That you're absolutely right. That we need new people. And I did a column right after the election, which I told a story about a friend of mine who was a longtime union guy at Oscar Mayer, and had always voted. With the union, whoever the union endorsed. And he called me just before the election to talk about something else. But then he said to me, Dave, I'm going to vote for all your endorsements except one. And I said, well, which one is that? And I'm not thinking that he was going to mention Kastenmeier. And he did. He said, well, I'm going to vote for Klug. I said, Jerry, what is the matter with you? For heaven's sake, Bob Castor is probably the best friend that labor has in Congress. He said, Jerry says, he's been there too long. He's been there for 32 years, and it's time to give somebody else a chance.
Yeah.
And I think that's, he only won Dane County by about 4,000 votes, and it was the strategic thinking back in those days that you had to win Dane County by 10,000 votes to offset some of the more conservative areas. So he failed to get a big enough margin in Dane County, and that cost him the election.
I think I remember a conversation with you. You were telling me about, I think, probably both Prox and Gaylord. They didn't particularly enjoy campaigning.
No.
I would imagine that's a strain that's true of
Right.
Bob Kastenmeier as well.
Bob hated, and going back to what we talked about, his modesty. He didn't like to stand up in front of a bunch of people and tell them how great he was.
Yeah.
And so
kind of have to do that in a campaign.
Yeah, and so that's a real disadvantage, and particularly in modern times and modern communication and stuff like that, it just is not a very good way. I remember Kaz Oshiki, his chief of staff, telling me that we tried to convince him he had to do this, but he would push us back all the time, and I think it was just a matter of. not only the anti-Congress feeling among a lot of people, but also the fact that Bob had been there a long time. Scott Klug looked like a nice young guy. He didn't seem to be the real right winger that, that might scare the heck out of a lot of liberals. And so why not give him a chance?
And he's familiar to people. He's coming to their living rooms every night.
That's
so.
correct. Yep. But he was known and a good-looking guy and quite frankly, smart guy.
Yeah, I met with him on fair housing and other issues.
Sure.
He wasn't totally unreasonable,
No,
but
no.
on the other hand, it was sort of a little bit of a facade because he voted
Correct.
with the Republican Party.
Absolutely, yeah. It turned out, which we comment on at great length as the years went by, but he was not the guy that we thought we were getting.
Well, we're down to about our last 10 minutes or so, so I want to flashback to some of the scope of the career with a couple of clips again, brief ones from Bob Kastenmeier in his own words. Mara, if we could cue up clip 6, please. This is in reference to the Vietnam War. I think we've noted this, but he was early in speaking out against this war. Ironically, one of the things in the C-SPAN interview that's not part of the clip is that I guess he did vote for the Tonkin War resolution, which was this moment when something had happened. There's kind of questionable circumstances about whether it really happened the way that it was portrayed, but it was a justification for further U.S. involvement in Vietnam.
Yeah.
He said he did vote for it, but then in retrospect, he had some doubts about this time. He started holding hearings in his district, which was more or less unprecedented at the time. But Bob Kastenmeier on the Vietnam War.
You were also an early opponent of the Vietnam War during the Johnson administration. Why?
I felt that the United States really had no business in that war. The United States' interests were not at stake in Southeast Asia, even as today, I think subsequent events demonstrate that. And so early I opposed the war. I had hearings in my own district on it, the first of a kind, and the New York Times praised these hearings because President Johnson was trying to shut down debate, did not want debate. This followed the spring hearings, the teach-ins at universities. And during the summer, I had these hearings to demonstrate that the issue is not foreclosed.
So, Dave, do you remember that time? Do you remember those hearings?
Oh yes, I do. It was like you say, it was unprecedented. To come back to your district and hold hearings on this on a war, that was quite divisive. And of course, Madison, particularly the University of Wisconsin, was really at the forefront of pushing back against this war with student demonstrations. Paul Soglin and the whole crew, but. I remember one of the early hearings, first days of the hearings, a bunch of UW students came down with 6,000 petitions, or petitions signed by 6,000 students supporting the war.
Yep.
And dumped it on his desk, and he accepted them very graciously, and then of course went on with the hearings, and so it was a real example of democracy in action. You had the anti-Vietnam War people explaining how divisive this was and the problems it was creating, and then you had the kids who said, "Hey, wait a minute, our country's right on this." And Kastenmeier, of course, came away with, I think the lessons of the hearings was that it showed how the war had really divided the people.
Yeah.
And like Kastenmeier said in that clip, he just felt that we didn't have any business being there, and it was time for us to get out.
And Bob Kastenmeier was in the middle of what was a really divisive debate here in Madison. People,
Right.
I think, again, Paul Soglin just turned 70. He was in his 20s
Right.
in that era. Involved with the anti-war protests at the university. And Paul had some wonderful things to say. I encourage people to go and view his comments in the Journal Sentinel and other places. But anyway, we forget that Madison had conservative mayors, had a police force that was doing very questionable things in terms of
And
the
a
way
sheriff.
they responded, and a sheriff. So
Both led. They were the sheriff's department, the police department, both gung-ho ex-Marines.
Right. So anyway, it was a very courageous stand
Yeah,
that he took.
right.
I want to play one other clip. We've got about 5 minutes left. That's clip 7, Mara. This is some interesting comments on Bob Kastenmeier's thoughts on Richard Nixon.
What about President Nixon? Did you have any sort of working relationship with him? And
I was one who was on President Nixon's enemies list, famous enemies list. For what reasons, I'm not sure. But I did play a major role during the impeachment, chaired by my chairman, Peter Odino, who did a magnificent job. My subcommittee drew up the rules by which the impeachment was conducted, and participation in that was important. I think that was a real contribution the Congress made in form and in substance. On the other hand, in retrospect, I thought that Nixon's 6 or 7 years was certainly superior to Mr. Reagan's. I thought that the policies, the attempt to somewhat open up a dialogue with the Soviet Union, and certainly with the People's Republic of China through Kissinger, was a very constructive policy. And in some of the social and economic policies of that administration, they were much more moderate, I think, than the Reagan years.
So just to punctuate again, he played that crucial role in the House Judiciary Committee. He really helped to dictate the form that the reaction and the impeachment proceedings took.
Right.
I apologize because we're out of time. We'll have to leave that one hanging in the wind, and we'll talk about it more at length. But I want to come back to just the general thesis that he was someone who could transcend political boundaries. He had kind things to say about Nixon, despite everything that was happening. Again, it was a time when there wasn't this horrible polarization that saw us to see things as black and white or up and down or whatever.
Yeah.
And we really need someone like Bob Kastenmeier to come into the fore again.
Right. Well, actually, right. It's too bad that era seems to have passed, and maybe it'll return. We can only hope.
You would hope that some of the folks that he mentored and he inspired as they come into power.
Exactly.
The folks that we mentioned today. So I want to close just on some of the observations you had in that interview. I believe it was dated March 11th of this year. You observed he may be 91 now, but the voice is just as strong and the concern about the direction of America just as keen as it was when he represented Wisconsin's 2nd District in Congress for 32 years. What I remember best about this Wisconsin political legend is that despite all the heated battles and contentious debates, he was always a gentleman who believed no matter how bitter the politics, the bottom line was to play fair. And he closed the conversation with these words: "Don't give up the ship," he said. "There are better days ahead." You share that?
Bob Kastenmeier.
And you share that vision? Do you share it partly because of all that Bob Kastenmeier was and did?
Yes, I definitely share that vision. I think we, having been in this business for 52 years now, or 53, I guess, the cycles continue, and I think there are better times ahead.
Hey, Dave Zweifel, it's been a great pleasure. We would love to have you back. Like I said, I've had so many great conversations with you about different eras. But 55, I'm a little bit younger than you, but it's really great for me to be able to remember some of this stuff and to be able to share this. So again, you will be speaking on Sunday, May 3rd at 1:30 p.m. Do you have a sense of who else is there besides yourself? And
Dave Obey, and I think some former members of his staff and others. I'm not sure exactly what lineup they have, but I'm sure it's going to be a really powerful one.
So again, Sunday, May 3rd.
What I'm doing in there, I don't know, but I'll be there. So.
Paul Rusk was saying we're so glad that we have Dave's voice on that stage. So Sunday, May 3rd at 1:30 p.m.
Right.
Winona Terrace.
Yeah.
Once again, Dave Zweifel, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Pay honor to, I'm sure, someone who you consider to be a good friend, Bob Kastenmeier.
Yes, he was.
All right. And this has been Forward Forum. Forward Forum at AOL.com is a way that you can provide your feedback, your comments, ideas for future shows. Give us a call at the Sun Prairie Media Center. And thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great week.